The light appeared exactly 3.7 seconds after the final heartbeat stopped, and Dr. Marcus Holbrook watched it rise from the body like breath made visible in winter air. It was not the kind of light that belongs in laboratories, not the sterile glow of fluorescent tubes or the cold illumination of monitors, but something else entirely, something that burned without heat and moved with intention. He had measured death 1,000 times before, but he had never seen it leave. Before we begin, we would like to know where you are listening to this story from and what time it is. The Whitmore Institute for Cardiac Research occupied the 3rd and 4th floors of a medical building in Providence, Rhode Island, a structure built in 1968 with narrow windows and hallways that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper. Dr. Holbrook had worked there for 11 years, studying the final electrical patterns of the human heart. The way cells continued to fire even after clinical death, the strange persistence of bioelectrical activity in tissue that should have gone silent. He was a cardiologist by training, a researcher by temperament, a man who believed that every mystery of the body could eventually be reduced to chemistry, voltage, and measurable force. He had published 17 papers on post-mortem cardiac function. He had examined tissue samples from more than 400 deceased patients. He had spent entire nights watching monitors, tracking the gradual dissolution of organized electrical activity into noise, into randomness, into nothing. Death, he believed, was not an event but a process, a cascade of failures that unfolded over minutes or hours depending on circumstances. The heart stopped, the brain depleted its oxygen, cells began to rupture, electrical gradients collapsed. There was no moment of transition, no threshold where life became non-life, only a slow degradation of systems that could no longer maintain themselves. He had written this in the introduction to his most recent paper. He had defended it at conferences. He had taught it to medical students who sat in amphitheater classrooms and took notes on laptops that glowed in the dimness. He did not believe in souls. The study that changed everything began in October of 2016, when the Institute received approval for a new protocol examining real-time bioelectrical monitoring during end-of-life care. The goal was to track cardiac, neurological, and cellular activity in patients who had elected to withdraw life support, to document the precise sequence of system failures with higher resolution than had ever been attempted. Holbrook assembled a team of 6 researchers, secured funding from 2 foundations, and spent 8 months installing equipment in a private observation room adjacent to the intensive care unit. They mounted cameras in all 4 corners. They positioned electroencephalogram leads, electrocardiogram sensors, respiratory monitors, temperature probes, and a custom-built array of bioelectric field detectors that Holbrook had designed himself. Devices sensitive enough to measure the faint electromagnetic signatures produced by living tissue. The first 3 subjects provided useful data, but nothing unexpected. Heartbeats slowed and stopped. Brain activity faded over 4 to 7 minutes. Body temperature began to drop. The electrical fields collapsed in predictable waves, like ripples moving outward from a stone dropped in still water. Holbrook documented everything, filled notebooks with observations, annotated video files, prepared preliminary findings for publication. The 4th subject was a man named Thomas Brennan, 73 years old, a retired high school teacher who had suffered massive brainstem damage following a cerebral hemorrhage. His family had made the decision to withdraw ventilator support after neurologists confirmed that recovery was impossible. Brennan had signed advance directives years earlier. Everything was legal, ethical, procedural. Holbrook met with the family, explained the study, obtained consent for monitoring. They were grateful that his death might contribute to medical knowledge. They sat with him for 2 hours before the procedure began, holding his hands, speaking quietly, saying goodbye. The monitoring began at 9:47 on a Thursday evening in March of 2017. Holbrook sat in the observation room with two other researchers, Dr. Lisa Chen and a graduate assistant named Martin Feld. The room was small and windowless, lit only by the glow of 6 monitors arranged across a long desk. Each screen displayed a different data stream: cardiac rhythm, brain waves, respiratory function, skin conductivity, core temperature, and the electromagnetic field readings from Holbrook's custom sensors. The walls were painted institutional beige. The air conditioning hummed. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. They watched as the ventilator was withdrawn at 9:52. Brennan's breathing reflex was absent. His chest did not move. His oxygen saturation began to fall immediately, dropping from 98% to 90 to 80 over the course of 3 minutes. His heart rate slowed, the rhythm becoming irregular, the peaks on the electrocardiogram monitor stretching further apart. Chen made notes on a laptop. Feld adjusted the gain on one of the sensors. Holbrook watched the numbers, the waveforms, the slow collapse of organized function. At 9:58 and 41 seconds, Brennan's heart stopped. The electrocardiogram trace went flat. No pulse, no electrical activity. The monitor emitted a single tone that the staff had muted in advance. Holbrook noted the time, wrote it down in the margin of his notebook, underlined it twice. Death, by clinical definition, had occurred. Everything that followed would be the aftermath, the gradual cooling and decay, the final dispersal of electrical potential. But the brain was still active. Holbrook leaned forward, staring at the electroencephalogram display. The waveforms were chaotic, irregular, nothing like normal brain activity, but they were present. Undeniable spikes and oscillations that should not have existed without oxygenated blood. He had expected this. Studies from the 1990s had documented brief surges of neural activity after cardiac arrest, possibly the brain's final attempt to restore function, possibly just random discharge as cells died. It usually lasted 30 to 90 seconds. This lasted longer. 2 minutes after the heart stopped, the electroencephalogram was still showing activity. 3 minutes, 4. The patterns were strange, repetitive, clusters of high-frequency oscillations that appeared and disappeared without rhythm. Chen glanced at Holbrook, her expression uncertain. Feld checked the sensor connections, made sure nothing had come loose. The readings were real. At 5 minutes and 18 seconds, something changed. The electromagnetic field detectors, the custom sensors that Holbrook had positioned around the bed, began registering a signal. It was faint at first, barely above background noise, a low-frequency oscillation centered approximately 15 centimeters above Brennan's chest. Holbrook stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. The sensors were designed to detect the weak magnetic fields produced by cardiac muscle, by neural tissue, by any organized electrical activity in the body. But Brennan's heart had stopped. His brain activity was fading. There should have been no source for this signal. The oscillation grew stronger. It began to move. Holbrook watched the readings, his mouth dry, his hands motionless on the desk. The signal was rising. Slowly, incrementally, drifting upward from Brennan's chest toward his head. The sensors tracked it, displayed it as a shifting point of electromagnetic density on the screen, a focus of energy that had no anatomical origin. Chen stood up, moved closer to the monitors, her face pale in the blue light. Feld said something. Holbrook did not hear what. His attention fixed entirely on the data. At 7 minutes and 12 seconds, the signal reached a position approximately 30 centimeters above Brennan's body, and then the light appeared. It was visible first on the video feed from the camera mounted on the north wall, a faint glow, colorless, almost imperceptible, hovering in the air above the bed. Holbrook thought initially that it was a reflection, a trick of the room's lighting, but the glow intensified, became distinct, became undeniable. It had structure, it moved. It rose slowly, steadily, with the same trajectory as the electromagnetic signal, as if the two phenomena were connected, as if the field they were measuring had become something visible, something real. Chen whispered something that might have been a prayer or a curse. Feld backed away from the monitors, his chair scraping against the floor. Holbrook sat frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. The light was beautiful and terrible. It did not behave like light should. It did not diffuse or scatter. It did not cast shadows. It simply existed, a luminous presence hanging in the air, shaped vaguely like a column or a plume, narrow at the base and widening as it rose. Holbrook could see it on all 4 camera feeds now, from every angle. A glowing form that seemed to generate its own illumination without any visible source. It was not bright enough to hurt the eyes, but it commanded attention, pulled focus, made everything else in the room seem dim and distant by comparison. The electromagnetic sensors went wild. The readings spiked, climbed beyond the scale Holbrook had calibrated, maxed out the display, and stayed there. The signal was no longer localized. It filled the room, saturated the sensors, created interference patterns that rippled across every monitor. Holbrook tried to adjust the sensitivity, tried to bring the readings back into measurable range, but the equipment could not contain what it was detecting. The field was too strong, too concentrated, too unlike anything the sensors had been designed to measure. And then it began to change. The light, the glow, the luminous column rising from Brennan's body started to shift in color. It had been white, or something close to white, something without hue or temperature, but now it darkened, became tinged with gold, with amber, with a deep radiance that reminded Holbrook of sunlight filtered through colored glass. The change was gradual, almost liquid, as if the light itself were a substance, a medium that could carry pigment. The golden glow intensified, grew richer, more saturated, until the entire column blazed with a color that had no name, a shade that existed somewhere between fire and dawn and the heart of a star. Holbrook felt something twist in his chest, something between awe and terror. The light continued to rise. It moved slowly, deliberately, ascending toward the ceiling at a rate of perhaps 2 or 3 centimeters per second. The electromagnetic readings tracked it, followed it, confirmed that the source of the field was moving in perfect synchronization with the visible phenomenon. Whatever this was, it was measurable. It was real. It existed in physical space, generated detectable energy, interacted with instruments designed to sense electromagnetic radiation. It was not a hallucination. It was not a trick. It was happening. At 9 minutes and 38 seconds after cardiac arrest, the light reached the ceiling and stopped. It hovered there, suspended, a column of golden radiance that stretched from a point approximately 20 centimeters above Brennan's body to the acoustic tiles overhead. The glow pulsed faintly, rhythmically, with a periodicity of roughly 1.2 seconds. The electromagnetic sensors registered corresponding oscillations, peaks and valleys in the field strength that matched the visual pulsing exactly. Holbrook realized, with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins, that he was watching something that should not exist, something that violated every principle of physics and biology he had ever learned. The light was not fading. It was not dispersing. It was waiting. Chen broke the silence, her voice hoarse and unsteady. "Marcus, what is that?" Holbrook could not answer. He had no framework, no vocabulary, no theoretical model that could encompass what he was witnessing. The brain activity on the electroencephalogram had gone flat 4 minutes ago. The heart had been silent for nearly 10. Brennan was dead by every medical definition, every clinical standard, every legal criterion. There was no biological process that could generate light, There was no electromagnetic phenomenon that could produce a localized mobile field of this intensity without a power source. It was impossible. And yet it was there. The pulsing continued for another minute, regular and steady, like a heartbeat translated into light. Then, without warning, the column began to collapse. The lower portion, the part closest to Brennan's body, started to fade, to thin, to lose coherence. The light retreated upward, drawing into itself, concentrating toward the point where it touched the ceiling. The golden color intensified, became almost blinding, a radiance that made Holbrook squint even through the camera feed. The electromagnetic readings surged again, peaked, held, and then the light exploded. It was not an explosion in the conventional sense. There was no sound, no shockwave, no release of heat or force. But the light expanded, suddenly and violently, filled the entire room with golden radiance so intense that all 4 cameras whited out simultaneously. The monitors went blank. The electromagnetic sensors flatlined, overwhelmed, their circuits saturated beyond recovery. Holbrook threw up a hand instinctively, even though he was separated from the room by a wall and a window, even though the light could not reach him. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, the observation room was filled with the reflected glow, bright enough to cast hard shadows, bright enough to make him see after-images when he closed his eyes. Then it was gone. The cameras recovered, their automatic exposure adjusting, the image returning. The room looked exactly as it had before. Brennan's body lay motionless on the bed, pale and still. The medical equipment stood silent. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, all unchanged. There was no trace of the light, no residue, no mark, nothing to suggest that anything unusual had occurred. Except the sensors. 3 of the 6 electromagnetic detectors had failed completely. Their circuits burned out, their displays dark. The other 3 showed residual readings that made no sense. Phantom signals that decayed slowly over the next 20 minutes. Holbrook checked the video files, scrubbed through the footage, confirmed that everything had been recorded. The light was there, visible on all 4 angles, documented in full color and high resolution. He had evidence. He had data. He had no explanation. The hospital staff entered the room at 9 minutes and 54 seconds after the light disappeared, following standard protocol for time of death confirmation. They examined Brennan's body, checked for pulse and respiration, noted the time in the medical record. They were professional, efficient, gentle. They saw nothing unusual. Holbrook watched through the window, silent, his hands trembling slightly. He did not tell them what had happened. He did not know how. The team spent the rest of the night reviewing the footage, analyzing the data, trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. Chen suggested equipment malfunction, but the light had been visible on 4 independent cameras. Feld proposed some kind of atmospheric phenomenon, a rare discharge of static electricity, but the electromagnetic signatures were all wrong. Holbrook said nothing. He sat in front of the monitors, watching the footage loop, watching the light rise and pulse and explode over and over until the sun came up and the morning shift arrived and they had to leave. He did not sleep for 3 days. The Institute's director, a neurologist named Dr. Patricia Voss, reviewed the findings in her office on the following Monday. She watched the video twice, read through Holbrook's notes, examined the sensor data. Her expression was unreadable. When she finished, she closed the laptop and looked at Holbrook for a long time before speaking. "This cannot be published," she said. Holbrook stared at her. "Why not?" "Because no one will believe it, because it will destroy your credibility, because it looks like fraud or equipment failure or a hoax, and no amount of documentation will convince anyone otherwise." She leaned back in her chair, her fingers laced together. "I believe you saw something. I believe the equipment recorded something. But I do not believe we can explain it, and I do not believe the scientific community will accept it. We have evidence, Holbrook said. Evidence of what? A light that appears after death? An electromagnetic field that shouldn't exist? Do you understand what you're suggesting? Do you understand what people will say? Holbrook understood. He understood perfectly. But he also understood that ignoring the phenomenon would not make it less real. They argued for an hour. Voss wanted to classify the findings as equipment error, to exclude the data from any publication, to move forward with the study using only the first 3 subjects as examples. Holbrook refused. He insisted on transparency, on reporting everything exactly as it had occurred. Voss finally agreed to a compromise. They would continue the study, monitor additional subjects, and see if the phenomenon repeated. If it did, they would have stronger evidence. If it did not, they would consider it an anomaly. The next subject was monitored in May of 2017. No light appeared, nor did it appear for the 6th subject, or the 7th, or the 8th. Holbrook watched each procedure with mounting frustration, hoping and dreading in equal measure. The equipment functioned perfectly. The data was clean. The deaths were documented with precision. But there was no electromagnetic anomaly, no luminous presence, no golden radiance rising from cooling bodies. Whatever had happened with Thomas Brennan, it was unique, unrepeatable, impossible to study. Holbrook became obsessed. He reviewed the footage every night, watched the light rise and pulse and explode, analyzed every frame, every pixel, every fluctuation in the sensor data. He cross-referenced Brennan's medical history, looking for anomalies, for factors that might have contributed to the phenomenon. He found nothing. Brennan had been ordinary in every measurable way. Average health, average physiology, no unusual medications or treatments. There was no reason his death should have been different, unless the difference was not in the body, but in what left it. Holbrook did not allow himself to think the word. Not at first, not consciously, but it was there, hovering at the edge of his thoughts, impossible to ignore. The light had risen from Brennan's body. It had moved with intention. It had waited, pulsed, and then departed. It had behaved in every observable way, like something leaving, like something separating itself from the physical form and ascending to somewhere else. Like a soul. He began to research, quietly, privately, in the hours when the Institute was empty. He read theological texts, philosophical treatises, historical accounts of deathbed visions and near-death experiences. He studied medieval descriptions of the soul, Renaissance debates about the nature of consciousness, modern theories of quantum consciousness and bioelectric fields. He found parallels, echoes, suggestions that others had seen similar things, though never with instruments, never with measurements. Ancient physicians spoke of a subtle light that departed at death. Tibetan monks described a luminous essence rising from the crown of the head. Christian mystics wrote of radiance accompanying the moment of transition. But none of them had video footage. None of them had electromagnetic readings. None of them had proof. In August, Holbrook made a decision. He contacted a physicist at Brown University, a specialist in electromagnetic phenomena named Dr. Raymond Kell, and invited him to review the data. He did not explain what it showed. He simply asked Kell to analyze the sensor readings and provide an interpretation. Kell agreed, curious, intrigued by the unusual request. They met in Holbrook's office on a Friday afternoon. Kell was in his late 50s, grey-haired and soft-spoken, with the cautious precision of someone who had spent decades working with instruments that could detect the invisible. Holbrook showed him the data first. The waveforms, the field strength measurements, the trajectory of the moving signal. Kell studied them carefully, made notes, asked technical questions about the sensor calibration and positioning. "This is extraordinary," Kell said finally. The coherence is remarkable. Whatever generated this field, it was highly organized, not random noise. And the movement is linear, consistent, as if something was actually traveling through space. He paused. What was the source? Holbrook hesitated. Then he showed him the video. Kell watched in silence. His expression did not change. When the light exploded and the footage ended, he sat back, removed his glasses, and rubbed his eyes. He was quiet for a long time. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "It's real," Holbrook said. "I recorded it myself. 4 cameras, 6 sensors, multiple witnesses." Kell put his glasses back on. His hands were shaking slightly. "Do you understand what you're showing me? I want you to tell me what I'm showing you." Kell turned back to the screen, played the video again, froze it at the moment when the light first appeared. "This is not a known phenomenon," he said. "The electromagnetic signature is consistent with what I'd expect from a highly localized plasma, except there's no ionization source, no heat, no containment, and plasma doesn't move like that. It doesn't hold coherence. It doesn't pulse with that kind of regularity." He gestured at the screen. "And it certainly doesn't explode into nothing." "Then what is it?" Kell was quiet. Then, slowly, he said, "I don't know. But if I were forced to speculate, I would say you've documented an energy transfer, something leaving a system. A discharge of organized information, possibly, or a field collapsing in a way we don't have models for." He looked at Holbrook. "But you're not asking about physics, are you? You're asking about something else." Holbrook met his gaze. "Yes." "I can't help you with that," Kell said. "I can tell you what the instruments show, but I can't tell you what it means. That's outside the boundaries of what science can address. Or what science is willing to address." Kell did not argue. They spoke for another hour, discussing theories, possibilities, the limits of measurement and interpretation. Kell promised to review the data more thoroughly, to consult with colleagues if Holbrook allowed it. Holbrook agreed, with the condition that his name and the Institute's name remain confidential. They shook hands. Kell left. Holbrook sat alone in his office, the video frozen on his screen, the light hanging in the air like a question he could not answer. 3 weeks later, Kell called. "I've shared the data with 2 colleagues," he said. "Both of them came to the same conclusion I did. We don't have a physical explanation. The field is real, the movement is real, but there's no known mechanism that could produce it under these circumstances." He paused. "One of them suggested that you might have recorded something biological, some kind of electromagnetic signature associated with neurological shutdown. But that doesn't account for the light, or the trajectory, or the final burst. Honestly, Marcus, I think you've documented something no one has seen before." "And what do I do with that?" "I don't know. Publish, maybe. Let others try to replicate it. Or keep it private if you're not ready for the controversy." Kell's voice softened. "But if you're asking my personal opinion, not as a scientist but as a person, I think you've seen something important, something that matters. I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's random." Holbrook thanked him and ended the call. He never published the findings. The study continued through the end of 2017 and into 2018, monitoring 15 more subjects, documenting their deaths with the same meticulous care. The light never appeared again. The electromagnetic sensors detected nothing unusual. The data was consistent, unremarkable, exactly what Holbrook had expected when the study began. He wrote the final report, submitted it for peer review, saw it published in a respected journal in March of 2019. The paper made no mention of Thomas Brennan, no mention of light, no mention of anything that could not be explained. But Holbrook kept the footage. He stored it on 3 separate hard drives, backed it up to encrypted cloud storage, labeled it with careful notation. He told no one else about it. He did not show it to colleagues, did not present it at conferences, did not submit it for review. It remained his secret, his evidence, his proof of something he could not name. He watched it sometimes, late at night, when the institute was empty and the city outside was dark. He watched the light rise and pulse and explode, watched the radiance fill the room, watched the moment when something impossible became visible. And each time he felt the same mixture of awe and terror, the same sense that he had witnessed a boundary being crossed, a threshold being passed, a truth being revealed that was too large and too strange for the language of science to contain. He did not know if it was a soul. He did not know if such a thing even existed, but he knew what he had seen, and he knew that it meant something, even if that meaning would remain forever beyond his ability to measure or define. Years passed. Holbrook retired from the Institute in 2023. He moved to a small house near the coast, spent his days walking on beaches, reading, trying to forget. But he could not forget. The light stayed with him, vivid and undeniable, a memory that refused to fade. He dreamed about it sometimes. Dreams where the light rose from his own body, where he felt himself separating, ascending, becoming something other than flesh and blood and electrical impulse. He woke from these dreams gasping, his heart racing, unsure whether he was terrified or relieved. In the final months of his life, when cancer made it clear that his own death was approaching, Holbrook returned to the footage one last time. He watched it in silence, alone, the room dark, except for the glow of his laptop screen. The light rose. The light pulsed. The light exploded. And Holbrook understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence or measurement or data, that he would see it again. Not from outside, not as an observer, but from within. He would be the light. He would be the thing that left. He died 3 weeks later, in a hospice room, with white walls and machines that beeped softly in the darkness. The staff reported nothing unusual, but afterward, when they reviewed the security footage, they found something strange. For exactly 4 seconds, at the moment when the monitors showed his heart stopping, the camera in his room had recorded a faint glow, barely visible, hovering above the bed. It was there in 3 consecutive frames, and then it was gone. The resolution was poor, the lighting was bad. It could have been anything, a reflection, a lens flare, a quirk of digital compression. Or it could have been something else. The footage was archived and forgotten. The room was cleaned and prepared for the next patient. No one thought to look for electromagnetic anomalies, or to measure the air, or to ask whether something had left that could not be weighed, or counted, or contained. The world continued, indifferent and rational, governed by laws that admitted no exceptions. But the light had been there, and somewhere, in the space between heartbeats and silence, between flesh and whatever lies beyond, it might still be rising,